Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me today in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and, oh yeah, that sometimes messy thing that we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com. All right, Bokeh Podcast listeners, thank you so much for joining us for yet another Bokeh Podcast episode. And I'm here with my new friend, Emma O'Brien. Emma, thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, I'm really glad to have you. And you're talking to us from kind of the other side of the world. Where are you?
I am in South Africa, so I'm very close to Johannesburg. So yes, long way away from you.
You are. And then you also mentioned too, before we started recording, that it's a little bit chilly there. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it's winter here at the moment. And I think people, including me before I moved here, think Africa's warm the whole time. And winter is actually very cold. So I'm sitting bundled up in my office with many layers on.
Well, we hope you don't get too cold or start shivering during our conversation. But thank you so much for making time for us today. And we're going to actually talk about something that we have really yet to delve into on the Bokeh Podcast, and that is pet photography, more specifically dogs. And we'll get to that here in just a few minutes. But we normally start off the podcast with something called our tool for time or technique for time. And I'm curious for you as a photography business owner, what's something that you do on a regular basis to create space for yourself and for those around you?
Okay, so I think like many of your other guests, time and time management is an issue. I will open by saying that I do generally work 7 days a week, which doesn't sound very good, but I schedule my time and my shoots and my admin work very carefully so I don't end up feeling very overwhelmed, because I think it's easy as a business owner to end up with too much on your plate and getting very stressed out.
Yeah,
I know burnout's been a topic for you before with some of your guests. So I try to have at least 3 days where I'm at home and I'm not going anywhere, so I can sit and get my admin done and just try to keep on top of all the back end office stuff. And then I carefully schedule shoots. You know, I can have 2 or 3 shoots a day at the weekend, but I make sure I've got plenty of time in between so I can take a break, and I turn up to each client fresh, and I'm able to be creative with each person I'm working with.
So you mentioned a few things there that I'm curious about. First of all, you said a schedule. Do you have like a daily schedule, or does it vary from week to week?
So I just try to, at the beginning of the week, look at what I've got to do and then look at where I can slot that in. Invariably, my Saturdays and Sundays are very full, so I try to make Monday a day at home. So if I can get everything done, I'll maybe finish at 12. But it's not always possible. But I do make sure that I have got the computer switched off by 5. I actually refuse to sit in the evening and work. That's a non-negotiable for me. So very occasionally, if I'm really busy, but it's quite important to switch off and have some downtime in the evening for me. So that's a priority.
Yeah, I like that. And I know that everybody's schedule is a little bit different. And so maybe there are situations where that kind of dogmatism can't be applied to, or dogma can't be applied to a schedule. But
yeah,
the notion of shutting off in the evening, especially, if you or any of our listeners are getting up at the beginning of the day and just going hard all day long, the idea of drawing that work out into the evening when mentally, emotionally, you're exhausted, it probably isn't doing a lot of benefit for your business anyway. And for the sake of our health, giving ourselves that break, like you said, is so important. You mentioned photographing or working at least throughout the week. Is your business just growing? Is that what's kind of driving that day-to-day, that heavy work schedule?
Yeah, I'm very busy. So it's probably, we'll get to pricing. It's probably time for a little bit of a price increase, I think, because it has got very hectic and very busy. I think that the problem with self-employment is that it's not always consistent. So You have some periods of time where it's quite quiet. I'm going through a very busy time at the moment, which I'm very grateful for. The one thing in terms of, because it sounds like I work all the time, and it is important to have a break. So my partner and I do try to schedule a few days away every 6 weeks or so. So we totally get away from both of our businesses. We get away from the zoo that we live in with all the dogs, because sometimes we need a break from the animals because there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
So we just try and get away just to totally kind of de-stress and chill and have a bit of time together, because he's also got a very hectic work schedule. So I think, which is partly why I end up kind of working a lot, because he's often not home. So it's not like I'm working and avoiding everybody.
Sure. Well, there's something to be said, though, for proactively scheduling time away. And this is something, in fact, I was just doing a workshop virtually with some photographers yesterday, and I was talking about the significance of setting aside money throughout the year for traveling, not just once. The kind of traditional, at least in the States, kind of the traditional approach to vacation, especially for those who work in the corporate world, is 1 week a year is kind of your quote vacation week, and you get away and you can put everything into that and you look forward to that 1 week a year. As entrepreneurs, we should be taking advantage of the freedom and the flexibility that we can have and getting away more consistently. And part of that, of course, is setting the time aside. Part of it is setting the money aside to do so. But I think it's so great. And it's also great. I mean, this is not technically a relationship podcast, but it's also great for the sake of relationships to get away, to have adventures, to have new experiences together. That makes so much difference, especially in romantic partnerships. So I think it's wonderful that you do that very proactively. Tell us something kind of random about yourself that most people might not know.
Should I say I've got quite a few tattoos that nobody sees? Should I? I've just said
I
it now.
love it.
Everybody knows now.
Surprise!
And then surprise! If you see a picture of me, I don't look like I would have. So that's
You know what? I say this from time to time, but one of my favorite things about life are contrasts.
Yeah.
Where you're surprised you have this one side, especially when it comes to people, when you have this one side of an individual. I'm looking actually at the about page of one of your websites, and I'll just go ahead and mention the website to our listeners. If you're listening, and make sure you go to dogart.co, just like it sounds, DOGART.co. But on your about page, I'm looking at a picture of you very professionally dressed, and I would not guess that you have tattoos. So I love that contrast. I think that's a beautiful random fact about you.
I also like listening to 90s house music, which may be worse than the tattoos. I don't know.
I love that. No, that's so perfect. Well, I mentioned earlier that we're going to be talking about dog photography, and that is more and more your niche, your focus, what you're spending time on. But talk to us a little bit about how you got into photography in the first place.
Okay, so I'm British, so I've been in South Africa for 8.5 years now. So I started in photography in 2004. I went to college and I did a higher national diploma. And whilst I was at college, in doing my course, and of course we were all in the dark room still then, which is sort of very few people are doing now. So I started, and I always had an interest in photojournalism, which was kind of what I wanted to do. Haven't gone down that road, obviously. But and then whilst I was at college, I started shooting weddings for a local studio. And I think I'd gone out and shot 2, and I got paid £50 for each wedding I shot on behalf of this guy, who, really. And I shot 2 of them. I thought, you know what? I think I can probably just go and do this myself. So that's kind of where I started. And I think the weddings... The weddings were just kind of, I think it's how a lot of people start with photography, because it's actually quite an easy way in. Look, I knew nothing when I started, really, and then I was obviously studying at the same time.
Now, I have to interrupt you for just a second, because you said something interesting, and that is, you said it's the easy way in. And I know a lot of photographers, they'd be raising their hand and say, wait, easy? Is wedding photography easy? Tell us what you mean by that.
It was just, I think maybe it's just because I got a bit of a rundown from this guy, and I think maybe I'd gone out on a wedding with one of the girls who was also in my class, who'd shot a few more weddings than me. We went out together, and I kind of looked at it and thought, yeah, no, this is not really that difficult if there's planning for it.
Ah, interesting.
So I kind of obviously carefully planned out a shot list, and bear in mind the weddings I was shooting, people weren't paying very much for them. So there wasn't a high expectation. So I think it was, when I say it was easy, it was kind of quite easy to learn as I went along, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, that totally makes sense. But you mentioned...
I was also learning, sorry to Nathan to interrupt. I was also learning on somebody else's time, actually, for the first few I did. So I just handed the pictures over. So it wasn't really my problem to deal with anybody who was unhappy if they were. But I'm sure they weren't.
I love it. Well, but you make such an important point, which is the significance of planning. You know, when it comes to actually photographing a wedding, I would suggest that maybe the planning, the schedule of the day, the logistics are certainly one of the most complicated aspects of photographing a wedding. The other, and what becomes more nuanced and where I think wedding photographers become more talented, hopefully, is capturing the nuances, the moments, the in-betweens, if you will. That becomes a whole different skill set that photographers can develop over time. But the planning makes all the difference in the world, both for the sake of the client's experience as well as your ability to be able to capture those images. So that's really, really good. Yeah. You made the transition, or you're in fact even still in the process of making the transition to focusing more and more on photographing dogs. Talk to us a little bit about that process.
Okay, so the weddings, I'd shot weddings in the UK for like 5 years or so before I moved to South Africa. And I unfortunately got divorced in 2007. So actually kind of really killed weddings for me.
Yeah, understandably.
So when I moved to South Africa, I decided I was actually totally retiring from wedding photography, and I was going to focus on portrait photography. So, which is what I came here and did, and I started to build a business here. And then I went to a local SPCA here, and I adopted a little dog. And I said to them whilst I was there, look, you obviously need help with fundraising. I'm a photographer. What can I do? So we came up with the idea of putting a fundraising calendar together. And obviously I went out and started shooting animals and decided that A, I really enjoyed it, and B, I had a bit of a talent for it. So it totally happened by accident, falling into dog photography. Really, it was never a plan.
Now, you mentioned that you moved to South Africa, but that's a big move. Was it just like, hey, I need to hit the reset button?
No, I'd met somebody else after my divorce, and also a British guy who'd got a job here. So I kind of upped and left the UK with him to come and move here.
Well, there's something about making a big change like that, though, that can give us a different perspective. And I wonder if that played into this move into dog photography. I mean, that's a really, really big shift, going from photographing humans to photographing dogs specifically. What's it like? What led to that? You said it was kind of accidental, but ultimately, of course, you had to make a choice. You know what? I'm going to go down this road. I'm going to focus on this niche. What led to that decision?
I really love dogs, and I really enjoy photographing them. I think because it's quite a challenging thing to photograph. It's something that lots of people, there's that lovely adage of never work with animals or children. And I think it's the challenge of photographing them and managing to get a really beautiful portrait, which makes it continually very interesting for me, because no two dogs are the same. And every shoot it's always a bit of a challenge. And I like being around dogs. I am crazy dog lady, be the first person to admit that.
You mentioned that on your website too, but I'm looking at this picture again of you on your About page, and what's your dog's name there next to you?
So that is Victoria, who's with me there.
Victoria looks like she's smiling beautifully too. I love how her personality kind of shines through in the image. That's beautiful.
Yes, she's a little bit of a cheeky one, is Victoria. She's very naughty.
Well, how do you ultimately get the word out that, you know what, I'm transitioning my brand, and maybe being in the new market made it easier to do this, but how do you communicate to potential clients or get the word out? I think this is more of a marketing question at this point. How do you market dog photography to the potential market? Is there a really incredible opportunity there in that market to photograph pets? Was this a new idea to the market?
So how I kind of started building my reputation with dog photography in South Africa is after adopting my little SPCA dog and shooting the calendar, I started to get commissions from people to photograph to photograph dogs. And then I also started going to a few shelters and photographing dogs that were waiting to be adopted.
Oh, lovely.
And taking them out of their kind of quite sad shelter environment and shooting beautiful portraits of them, which really captured their characters. And of course, what happened was that people started to know about me from actually my volunteer work that I did, because the pictures would be shared on Facebook and kind of word got around that way with it. So it was never my intention to set out and go, oh, I'm going to do charity work because it's great marketing, because I'm not like that at all. It's kind of how it happened. So it's kind of it comes from a place of sort of making a difference that has actually then really expanded my reputation.
Would you say, and I know there's kind of a fine line here when we're talking about, as you alluded to, in fact, doing charity work and not expecting it to make a difference in marketing your business or building your business. But at the same time, there's a conversation around photography, the photographic industry, as to whether or not to charge or not charge, especially when you're getting started and you want to build a portfolio. I find it interesting that you were doing work that you weren't charging for, that you were volunteering your services, but that ultimately translated to business. Can you comment on that? What are your thoughts on photographing for free, if you will?
So I think in terms of charities, it's good to be photographing for free for them. What I did with, and any free, I don't often do kind of other pro bono stuff, but anything I do, I make sure that I've got my logo on the pictures that go online, so people know who took the picture. Because I think in terms of the fact you've given your time for free, you do deserve to get some sort of recognition and coverage for it.
Right.
I think when you're starting out and building a portfolio, shooting for free is one thing, but I'm of the opinion that for clients in general, free has no value. So I think for anybody, even kind of beginning, you've got to charge some sort of shoot fee, so that people do have a slight investment in what you're doing. So I think it's very easy if you're offering a free shoot for people to cancel or make no effort. So true. So I think there is a fine line, or I think if you decide you're going to do some free shoots to build a portfolio, you put a limit and you say, I'm going to do 5, and then after that, that's it. Because otherwise you'll be shooting for free forever. That's good. Well, there again, we're talking about the idea of planning. Having a plan in mind, especially when it comes to this idea. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to build a business, and in order to do so, we need to generate a little bit of revenue. But I like the fact that you point out that clients will, or potential clients will not value our work as much if there isn't a price tag associated with it. Because these days, I mean, I have a hard enough time scheduling get-togethers with friends, much less clients. If we're not actually attaching a price tag to it, it can certainly complicate things. So I love that point. I'm curious, though, you mentioned getting started in photography. Over the span of years that you've been photographing, what would you say has been the toughest lesson that you've learned as a business owner so far? I think pricing accordingly has been a tough lesson. So leading on from the working 7 days a week that I have discussed, I actually had a massive burnout at the beginning of 2016, like total crying on the floor, total mess. And to top it off, I put my back out lifting my lights into the car, which actually was a bit of a blessing because it meant I had to take a week off, because I think I wasn't charging enough, so I was overworking. I had too much on my plate, and I got totally overwhelmed. And it was actually at that point that I started working with a coach. So I started working with Polly Alexander, who's been one of your previous guests on the show, who is fabulous. Yes. And actually we worked with rejigging my pricing. And actually what we effectively did was double my basic shoot fee. Wow. Which to me was utterly terrifying, because I think we often sit in this position of being overwhelmed and overworked and kind of undervalued, but it's terrifying to change it because you think maybe if I put my prices up, all the clients are going to disappear. So it's kind of better the devil you know when you've got bills to pay. And actually sometimes you have to take a step back and go, hang on, can I continue like this? And for me, the answer was a very definite no, because I'd really, got myself to the point of being very unwell. So we sat and we worked out new pricing. As I say, we literally doubled my basic shoot fee, and we priced it accordingly, that if people booked that and then didn't buy anything else, it was fine because I'd been working on quite a low shoot fee and gambling on being able to upsell all of my clients, which, as we know, is not always possible.
Yeah, this is a really loaded conversation. And since we mentioned Polly, I want to make sure that our listeners know, if you haven't had the opportunity to listen to Polly Alexander's conversation with me on the Bokeh Podcast, go back to episode 107. And she actually talks about 10 different ways that our photography business is losing money. And it's, of course, extremely relevant to this conversation here. It's a tough thing to bump our prices up and risk that potential loss of client base, because not only are we're kind of taking ourselves out of a market. Now we have to build our business within a new market. I mean, I did this time after time after time as a wedding photographer. And unless you have a really strong network, that can be a really difficult thing, particularly as a wedding photographer.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. So I put the prices up and then I sat for 6 weeks with no bookings.
Wow.
Which was terrifying.
Yeah. What's going through your mind as you're sitting there thinking about this?
What's going through my mind is I've just ended my business. What the hell have I done?
Yeah.
What am I going to do? I might have to get a job. And I think I've been out of the employment line for so long. What am I going to do? So actually it was total panic. And then I kid you not, literally after 6 weeks, I had one day where I had 3 inquiries and they all booked at the new pricing. And at that point you think, okay, cool. And one of them actually included a previous client who'd worked with me kind of maybe 2 years before. So for her to be presented with this brand new pricing, which was massively higher than it was before, and for her to book and be cool, we value what you do, it's fine. It kind of gave me the thumbs up and I carried on, and then it picked up from there. But no, it was awful. It was really nerve-wracking. But it was the best thing I ever did, because what happened was then I ended up with less work and more income. And then actually you then end up qualifying better clients when you have a higher fee to start with.
For sure. Well, this reminds me of something that we've talked about here on the podcast, but it does not hurt to repeat it. And that is the significance of working intelligently. We talk a lot about working efficiently here at the Bokeh Podcast. But in conjunction with that, working intelligently, part of working intelligently is charging prices, as you're pointing out, Emma, that enable you to, first of all, reach your personal and, of course, business financial goals, but also help minimize burnout. Because, in this culture right now where you see hashtag hustle or some variation of it out there, this kind of obsession with working hard, it's a good thing to a point. But just simply being busy, almost haphazardly running our businesses versus very proactively running our businesses with certain goals in mind and pricing accordingly, it's two different things. And we have to make sure that we create that differentiation, not only for the sake of the health of our business, but also for our own personal health. That's so absolutely vital.
Yep. Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I think having had working with a coach was a big help with that, to have somebody else who was able to be quite objective about what I was doing. Because I think often this road as a photographer, if you're working for yourself, it's quite lonely because you don't necessarily have other people to chat to about it. And I think photographers can be quite cagey with each other about who's charging what. And so to have that kind of outside help was really made a huge difference for me.
It's true. And, there is something too about our photography industry. I mean, as wonderful as it is, especially again, in the American side of the industry, I'm not sure what it might be like in South Africa, but there is a tendency of just kind of coddling and you rock and you're awesome and that's great. And there's all this encouragement, which is wonderful. But at the same time, from time to time, we need somebody that can come in and intelligently give us constructive criticism. And again, that speaks to the significance of having a coach like you talked about. We'll make sure to link to Polly's website in the show notes. For those of you listening in, do make sure you go visit her website, as well as take a listen to the podcast episode 107. I want to kind of transition, go a little bit different direction here. I'm curious what is in your gear bag, and maybe if there is a difference now about the equipment that you're just obsessed with, that you really love, versus when you were photographing weddings.
So I'm very boring. I haven't actually changed the equipment I use at all. So I've got a Nikon D810,
Yes.
and I shoot most of the time with the Nikor 24-70 2.8 lens. And I trot around with a big reflector with me when I'm on location. And then I've got a little studio at home, so I've got some Bowen's lights that I use there. But I just try and keep it very simple, especially working with dogs. And whilst I do kind of photograph dogs on their own, I am finding myself more and more commissioned to photograph people's children, so newborn shoots and maternity shoots, because they have dogs. So for them, because I like working with dogs, it's quite a big pull for people that they can have their dogs included in a shoot. So I find it that the simpler I can keep the equipment, the better, because invariably you're kind of moving around quite a lot.
Yes.
And then I've also got an 85mm Nikor lens that sits as a spare. I actually don't use it very often because when I'm in people's houses indoors, it's actually not very practical. So it's the 24-70 all the way, really. Sorry, it's not more of an exciting exciting reply.
Not at all. No, I think this highlights something that we've talked about here on the podcast before, but again, can't be emphasized enough, and that is the importance of simplicity or minimizing the number of moving parts in our business. We have so much to keep up with as photography business owners, and it's easy, again, to kind of go into that reactive mode, just trying to keep our head above water, trying to run our businesses. The less that we have to keep up with, even down to the photographic equipment, the more that we can focus on what's actually important. And in your case, I mean, that 24-70 gives you such a lovely range, and it gives you flexibility, especially with the wide, because I can imagine these dogs are moving around quite a bit. And so you can't just say, hey, stay right there and let me photograph you for a second. You've got to have some flexibility there, but now you don't have to think about changing lenses and doing this thing and grabbing that camera body, and you're just keeping it simple and you're focusing on the task at hand, which is capturing these dogs. And I think that's a wonderful example of how simplicity can actually enable you to be a better photographer. I think that's lovely.
Yeah. And I tend to, because I'm shooting kind of quite front on portraits a lot of the time, I'm quite close to my subject. So that's why also that lens is great, because then you're not kind of having to run away with a great big telephoto lens to get them all in shot. So that's quite nice, because the work I do is quite interactive. So it's important for me not to be too far away from everybody I'm working with.
Absolutely. No, I can imagine that. My former business partner would photograph kids and do these kind of lifestyle family sessions, and that 24-70 was certainly a favorite, just because, again, of that flexibility and the moving around constantly and kind of chasing the kids around. It gives you the flexibility that's necessary, and I think that's really important. So photographers listening in, simplicity, it's a wonderful thing. Just try it. Try to, if we're talking about the idea of kind of proactively running our business, having certain goals in mind and running our business accordingly. And the cool thing about having that big picture view is a phrase that I've talked about on the podcast before. Having an idea of where you're going with your personal life and how that translates to your business then enables you to filter out the stuff that's not absolutely necessary to your business. And again, that can apply even to something like photographic equipment. Be really clear about what you're doing. Get rid of the stuff that's not necessary to support those goals, and your life and business will be all the better for it. I think this is a lovely example. Thank you for that, Emma. What would you say are the biggest differences between, and this may be kind of a funny question, but between photographing humans and dogs? What's that experience been like?
Okay, so aside from the physical differences, the obvious. So I think the one thing that's quite challenging is getting dogs to follow instructions. So the dogs I work with vary from being very well trained to not very well trained at all.
Yeah.
So it's trying to, and then obviously I have to tell the human that comes with the dog this is what I would like you to do with your dog. And then they've got to try and kind of get their dog in the position in a sit, stay, or what have you. So I think the number one thing is getting dogs to follow instructions can be a little bit of a challenge. I'm sure we can all relate to sometimes getting people to follow instructions can be difficult as well. So
it's so true. It reminds me, have you ever seen the original 101 Dalmatians, the Disney movie?
Yeah.
When they kind of change the perspective. I love the kind of first person perspective from the dog, where the dog is talking about the human as they're human. You got to wonder what conversation is going on inside the dog's head as you're photographing. Like, what's this person doing, crawling around on the ground or running after, chasing after me, trying to get a picture of me? I just love that. I love that picture. But I didn't mean to interrupt your flow. Tell us another difference.
Okay, so the other thing that kind of is a bit of a challenge is the fact that dogs have a very short attention span. So it is very similar to photographing small children. You've got to kind of keep it interesting for them and work efficiently, because you've invariably got a period of time whereby they'll be alert and they'll keep looking at you and it'll be interesting to them. And then after a while, they'll get to the point where they're like, okay, we're bored now. So one has to work quite efficiently to make sure you get nice interactive photographs of them. And I think the last thing that I would say is lighting. I tend to make sure the dog portraits I take are quite evenly lit and the dogs are lit sort of front on, because unlike human faces where you can side light and it looks beautiful, you actually can't do that with dogs, because especially, squishy faced dogs maybe a little bit more, but you end up with, you can't kind of have one half of their face in shadow because it looks very odd. And you've also got to be careful of how much shadow their nose is cast over their neck as well, so you don't lose detail underneath. So it's a little bit of a different one in terms of the lighting challenge.
And did you learn some of these techniques that you're speaking to? Because that's a detail that I certainly wouldn't have thought of. These types of the technical aspects of photographing dogs, was this something that you just learned over time? Were you reading books, looking at websites? How did you learn these things?
I think it's sort of because I've got obviously spent quite a lot of time photographing people beforehand. My knowledge of lighting is pretty good. I won't say I'm any sort of technical expert, but my knowledge of lighting is pretty good. So for me, especially with dogs, you can kind of, obviously if you're outdoors, you can kind of see what the lighting's doing. And in studio, I guess it was a little bit trial and error. But it was just a sort of natural progression from photographing people. So I can't say there's anywhere specific I picked that up. It's just kind of happened along the way. Sure.
Well, and ultimately just paying attention. You photograph it the way that you photograph humans or people, and that doesn't work. So you make some adjustments, and that just speaks to a little bit of self-awareness, and it takes some time sometimes to, I think for our listeners, it's a good thing to take some time and analyze their work. Look through and look for ways that they can continue to improve. And this can come from, of course, comparing your work with other photographers, but I think there's a healthy line to be drawn even in that too.
Yes.
Awareness,
Agreed.
though, especially when it comes to lighting, is so important. And I love your attention to detail in that. What would you say is the most difficult aspect of photographing dogs?
So it is leading on from the following of instructions. I think it's getting them to do exactly what you want. So for general client shoots, I'll chat to clients and sort of see what it is they want from their shoot, what they're kind of expecting, whether they want studio or location or at their home. So then it's quite easy to go with a loose plan. I tend not to try not to plan dog shoots too much. You can go with a plan and then kind of work within the parameters of that, depending on how the dogs are and what happens. But I shoot magazine covers for a magazine called Canine Zone here, and obviously for a dog magazine cover, the remit is kind of front on, looking at camera. So I had a shoot recently with a bull terrier, and she was brought through to the studio, and it was for a Valentine's Day. It was their Valentine's issue. So I'd made this lovely backdrop with colourful paper fans, and I got it all set up, and I knew kind of in my mind what it was going to look like. Yeah. And we could not get this dog to sit still in front of the backdrop.
Yeah.
At all. She'd sit next to me, she'd sit behind me, or if she did kind of sit there, she'd be slightly sideways on. And actually, after 45 minutes with this shoot, I thought, wow, I actually think I'm going to have to can this because I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure I'm going to get the shot. So, and then I kind of thought, actually, I'm not going to be beaten by this. I've never had a dog shoot that I've had to kind of can, So
Sure.
it's actually, luckily, my boyfriend was at home. So I came out and I said to him, can you please come and help me with this dog? So in he came. And actually, in the end, we had to position Luca in front of the backdrop. Alfred had to sort of lie on the floor next to her with one hand just under her chest and one on her bottom to hold her in position. And then eventually we managed to get her to just put her ears up and get the shot. Because anybody who knows bull terriers will know that they often sit with their ears back and they look like seals.
Seals, okay.
Which is not really the look we're going for on a magazine cover. So we eventually got this shot. But I think that was probably the most challenging thing. But, that was because I'd sat with this particular shot in mind and I kind of didn't have very much flexibility with it. And I think the thing with dogs is they are, they're their own little creatures and you actually kind of have to sort of work around them for the most part. So
That's
but it
interesting.
Worked out.
Yeah, it worked out. But it's interesting too, to me, to kind of hear the dichotomy between what you emphasized earlier, which was logistics and planning, especially when it comes to wedding photography, versus photographing dogs and just being okay with going with the flow. Understanding that you can't plan too much when you've got this four-legged furry friend of yours. Kind of it sounds so adorable, the idea that the dog is sitting next to you and behind you. I mean, do you have a hard time actually getting mad at the dog when they just look so cute? It's not like they're like photographing kids where they're screaming at you or something.
No, I think it was just because I'm like really new to get this shot that look, I'm very patient with dogs, and actually I think it's very fun when they come and they want to lick you and sit on you, and it's actually often it's worse trying to communicate to the dog owner what you want, because this poor woman was apologizing to me about the dog, and I'm like, it's fine, but we need to get her over here, So but yes, it's very hard to get mad at dogs because they don't really understand what's expected of them, especially when they've been brought to the studio and it's a new environment and things. So sure.
Well, I have to emphasize here, the fact that you're able to go with the flow speaks to your technical ability as a photographer. And, as a wedding photographer or a portrait photographer, you do have to be practiced in your craft in order to then be in the moment and be able to go with the flow, make sure that you've got the technical aspect down. So in the moment that you can just go with the flow and capture what you can as necessary. And that speaks to your technical ability. And I think that's really important for our listeners to keep in mind. What would you say is the most rewarding aspect of photographing pets, or more specifically photographing dogs?
Okay, so aside from if you've got like quite a challenging dog and I managed to get a good shot, that's a lot of fun. And then presenting clients with the end product and having them being super happy because you've got beautiful pictures of their dog, that's great. But I think one thing that I find very rewarding, going back to the shelter dog photography, is when I photographed a dog that's sitting at a shelter waiting for a home, and I get a message from the person who's adopted the dog to say, thank you so much. I wouldn't have known about this dog if I hadn't have seen the picture you've taken. And now here he is on my bed. And I think that for me is incredibly rewarding, and that makes me very, very happy. I had a lovely message like that a couple of days ago. And I think it just kind of reiterates the importance for me of kind of doing the voluntary dog photography, if you like. It's an extracurricular thing for me, but it just actually being able to use my skills to give back is wonderful for me. So yes, I think that's the most rewarding aspect of it.
I love that. And I think it would be good for all of us in some way to find a way to give back, to give to some type of movement that has a bit of a deeper meaning than just simply photographing a session for the sake of putting some more money in the bank. And I love that that's been an emphasis for you and your business. But then, of course, the beautiful thing is, even though you're not trying to, it becomes a benefit for your business. Yeah. And there's kind of a beautiful chemistry in that. And that's really, really lovely. One of the things that I know that you like to focus on when it comes to capturing dogs is the personality, their character. And this is something we would normally talk about, of course, when it comes to photographing people. But why is this so important to you? And what does it look like to try to capture the personality of a dog?
So I think if you have a look through my work, both of dogs and people, my pictures have quite a lot of energy and vibrance to them, because you'll see pictures with people laughing and kind of generally having a good time. So for me, those are it's capturing that energy. So I've kind of translated that into the dog photography by making sure that the portraits I get, I've got dogs looking kind of straight into camera, and wherever possible, they've got ears up and they look quite animated. Because I think for most dog owners, we enjoy it the most when we chat to our dogs and they look like they're responding to you, or they're listening very carefully to you. The magic word in my house is biscuits. Would you like a biscuit? Everybody looks very excited about that. So,
hey, I would look excited about that.
Just not biscuits that I've baked.
Fair enough.
Shop bought biscuits. So for me, it's translating that into photo shoots with other people's dogs.
Yeah.
So, which is sometimes easier said than done. My kind of techniques for doing that are to make sure we've got snacks on hand, because invariably dogs will respond to food. And for dogs that like toys or balls or that kind of thing, then we'll use that. I've also got a really brilliant app on my phone called Dog Sounds, which I just downloaded from the App Store, which has got a whole host of lovely noises that dogs enjoy. So dogs barking, squeaky balls, cats, that sort of thing. So invariably playing those and waving snacks has the desired effect to get dogs looking animated and very happy.
And is this, do you find yourself kind of multitasking then? Are you holding that your phone with the app playing in one hand and the camera in the other and trying to grab the picture?
Sometimes, yes. Invariably, if you can get a dog sitting and get their owner far enough away that they can kind of hold stuff above the camera lens for me, that's great. But yes, I kind of feel like sometimes I need an extra couple of arms to try and. So it is a bit of a multitask. And actually, you have people kind of say after a dog shoot when they see the pictures. They're always quite thrilled and surprised at the pictures they see, because they'll say to me, well, I didn't think we got anything because the shoot was like total chaos.
Yeah.
And you say, well, it's it's just about kind of being able to discern when to take the picture and to make sure you kind of you shoot quite a lot of pictures as well during a shoot. So.
Sure. Well, and again, it speaks to your talent. And for those of you listening in, and again, if you didn't hear Emma's website earlier, make sure you go to dogart.co. And just as a side note, Emma, you and I were talking about this before we started recording, but you have a secondary website as well, Emma O'Brien. We talked a little bit about, or just mentioned briefly earlier, the transition from people photography, if you will, to focusing more and more on dog photography. Can you just talk to us briefly about that transition, what that looks like? Because I know many photographers can relate to the idea of focusing on one genre and then wanting to go to another one. What does that look like for you, and how are you going about that process?
So the emmaobrien.com website has been my main portraiture website, and it's got things like my kind of maternity and newborn, personal branding, and it's got the dog photography on there. But I decided at the end of last year that where I want to be going is really just focusing on photographing dogs and the people that kind of belong to them. But so I thought kind of the best thing to do is to set up a separate website, which I've done, which has just got this is dedicated to the dog photography. So, but I'm not quite brave enough yet to transfer the emmaobrien.com domain over to the dog photography site. So I think that's kind of a work in progress, if you like. It's almost like I'm a little bit worried to cut it off because I don't want to totally stop doing people photography. So I think it's just how I work out kind of what I do with that. So it's just a bit of a work in progress. But I think it's also what I wanted to do is kind of build content on the Dog Art website and start getting that out there before I change the other one. I probably will keep the other one, but I'll put it as a local domain here and then transfer the dog one to emmaobrien.com, because I kind of have built my reputation as the person who photographs dogs.
Well, there's something to be said for specialization. We've talked about it on the podcast before. It can be a bit nerve-wracking to take that leap. But I have to give you props for making that effort and making that transition, because, especially when it comes to creating a niche and marketing your business, it makes it so much easier if you can say very specifically, this is what I do, versus I specialize in, these 5 different types of photography. And I've heard photographers say that kind of thing before, and it becomes confusing for somebody who is not a photographer. For example, I'll speak to the wedding industry again, because that's what I was most familiar with. But we go to a networking event and there might be 3 or 4 other photographers there. along with other vendors from the industry. And those photographers would say just that, I specialize in, and then they'd list 3, 4, 5 different types of photography. And of course, that's not really truly specialization. And then to the non-photographer listening in, they're looking at this photographer and all they see, there's this, I can almost picture this label above them that just says photographer. There's no distinction between this photographer and that photographer. The fact that you can say, I specialize in photographing dogs. I mean, there are not a lot of people that can say that. And so I love that you're making a further effort at that distinction. And I'm sure it'll make all the difference in the world for your brand. And it's a really, really impressive thing.
Yeah, I say it's a little bit scary, but I've also started branching the business out into working internationally as well. So I've just been in London recently, where I've done some dog shoots, which was lots of fun, shooting dogs in a new city, if you like. So obviously I'm from the UK, but being able to spend time in London running around with people and their dogs there was awesome. So for me, that's kind of the next step. So I think that's probably the antidote to getting rid of the portrait photography website, is just to keep going in the dog direction in a bigger way, if you like. So it kind of opens the market up. So I'm not just limiting myself to the local market.
Well, I'm extremely impressed by this, and we've certainly got your back. We're cheering you on. Go for it. Just
Thanks.
Go all the way with it. But this kind of begs a last question, which is, if our listeners are interested in getting into this market, because I would say, and maybe you can speak to this, but I would say that this is still a relatively new market, that the idea of paying money to hire somebody to come photograph your pet it seems a bit of you used the word luxury earlier, and I think it's a good word.
Yes.
But I think there's a wonderful business opportunity there for more photographers to get into the market. How would they most effectively go about that? Or maybe more specifically, you talked about capturing personality. How would they more effectively learn how to capture that personality of a dog and begin to photograph pets?
So I think you've got to love pets, and you've got to love dogs to actually branch out into photographing them for a start. But I guess you kind of probably wouldn't go down that road if you didn't. And I think I'm just trying to, because to say for me it happened quite organically and really by accident. So it wasn't much as we've been talking about planning and scheduling. It was kind of it fell into my lap, if you like.
Sure.
So I think there are, for anybody looking to get into the market, there are so many kind of dog clubs. There are an awful lot of shelters that need photography, and there are all sorts of kind of vet and pet shops, and there's lots of places where you can kind of start marketing your work and building a network. Because I think the thing with what's made it successful for me is building that network up. So obviously through the shelter photography I got to know people, and obviously people who are involved with animal welfare generally have millions of animals and also have lots of friends who have animals. So the kind of net kind of cast itself, if you like. So I think it's much like getting into baby photography or any kind of niche that you choose to go into. It's just kind of networking with suppliers and other similar complementary businesses that can then start to do referrals for you as well. I've got one of my friends has a dog blog, and she's also got a dog accessories company. And then I've kind of made friends with someone who makes dog treats. And so it kind of goes from there. So I've just sort of built this lovely, lovely network up, and it's just expanded.
Well, it speaks to the importance of, again, first of all, making yourself available, but then the significance of connections can never be minimized. And whether that happens through social media or in person, and I would suggest both should happen. There is something to be said for making connections. And I mentioned my former business partner earlier, but she focusing on lifestyle, baby photography and family photography, that business essentially launched through a connection with somebody in the local market who was connected to a bit of a higher end client bracket. And just the initial referral led to the first shoot, which then, of course, that person's connected to other people in this market, and they kind of they're keeping up with the Joneses, if you will. They also want in on that. They want some of that style of photography, and that led to a very successful lifestyle photography business for her. But the significance of connections can never be minimized. And that's something to be considered, especially for those who are just getting started as photographers. But when it comes to photographing pets, I mean, you mentioned earlier using snacks and toys, and we'll even link to the dog app. Is it just called Dog Sounds? That's just what it's called?
Yeah, it's just Dog Sounds. I think there are, I've got it. There's another one. There's another one by somebody called Whamsy. So if you go onto the App Store, I think there's quite a few. So this one I've got is literally just called Dog Sounds, and there's a picture of a little Labrador puppy on the app icon.
We'll link to that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, see if you can find it. It's got kind of barking of small dog barking, big dog barking, dogs whining and squeaking, and it generally does the trick.
Well, in addition to these tricks, speaking of, are there any other ideas that photographers should keep in mind if they want to more effectively capture the personality of a dog or a pet as a subject?
Okay, so I think the first thing is to be very. You've got to be very patient because, as we found out with the dog with the magazine shoot, they don't always know what you expect of them, and they're not always prepared to cooperate. So sometimes you just have to kind of leave them for a while to settle down. They might plonk themselves in a spot where you can take a picture, because some dogs do get a bit anxious, especially if they're somewhere new. So you've got to kind of work on an individual basis with them. Snacks and treats are always a win. You're going to have dogs who are your friends if you take them something they like to eat.
Yeah.
And then in terms of getting good dog portraits, I think all the rules of human portraiture apply. I always make sure I'm sitting on the same level as dogs, because invariably if you've got them at kind of eye level, you're going to get a better shot. But I think that also applies for children and things as well. So yes, there's a few things. I wouldn't say there's anything kind of in particular that I could say differentiates it massively. It's just one has to be patient and have a sense of humor.
That is fair. Well, yeah, that sense of humor enables the patience, right? Would you do you do consultations with the dog's owners prior to the shoot to get a feel for their personality, or even more specifically the types of treats that they like?
So I'd speak to clients over the phone before shoots and just try and find out a little bit about their dogs. And I tend to say to people to make sure they've got treats, because I'm encountering more and more here dogs with allergies and they can't eat this. So I tend not to take anything with me, and just tell people to get very prepped with what they've got. One of the things, I've got a friend who's a dog trainer who the term she uses with treats is you need to have high value treats. So things like chicken or cheese or kind of cold meat are good because they're really, really tasty for a dog rather than just an ordinary biscuit. So I tend to try and advise people to have something that is really tantalizing for their animals, so we make sure we get optimum cooperation. But sometimes you can get there and the snacks make everything worse because they won't sit still or leave their owner alone, with the packet of snacks. So you just kind of I just tend to go and just see what happens, because there's no point being too hung up on it, because it's like I say, sometimes chaos ensues, especially if there's more than one dog.
Yeah. Well, again, there's nothing to be nothing that we can emphasize more here than the importance of flexibility, especially when it comes to photographing these wonderful little animals that have been referred to as man's best friend or woman's best friend. They really are lovely, lovely. I've had multiple dogs over the years, and there is nothing like the experience of coming home to a dog who is just so genuinely excited to see you. Yeah. And I think you're doing a beautiful job of capturing that type of personality in your imagery. Again, for those of you listening in, do make sure that you go to dogart.co, DOGART.co, or Emma O'Brien, EMMAOBRIEN.com. And then, Emma, where can we find you on social media as well?
So my Facebook handle is at Emma O'Brien Photos with an S on the end. And then Instagram and Twitter is at Emma O'Brien Photo. I know I'm breaking all the rules there with not having matching social media handles. The Facebook page got started way before everything else did.
Sure.
So yes, you can find me online there. And I've got my other Instagram page, which actually is also I'm just building, is at Dog Art Photography as well.
Beautiful. Well, we'll make sure to link to these in the show notes. Thank you so much, Emma, for making time for the Bokeh Podcast today, for sharing your wonderful insight into photographing dogs.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been wonderful being here. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast today. Will you let us know what you think by leaving a review of the podcast in iTunes or maybe in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast, maybe suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My direct email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com.